Tom Mahoon. I chair the BFA program in Visual and Critical Studies. We're very happy to be hosting this evening's event. We're very fortunate to have with us Mr. Frank Gillette. Let me tell you just a little bit about Frank before I turn it over to him. Frank was born in 1941 in Jersey City. He attended for just a couple of years Columbia University, then he dropped out. Then he spent a couple more years at Pratt Institute, and he dropped out. Those things seem not to have diminished his ability to become the recipient of many quite distinguished awards, including fellowships from the Rockefeller Foundation, the Guggenheim Foundation, grants from the New York State Council of the Arts, the National Endowment for the Arts. He was at the American Academy in Rome in the mid-80s. He's the author of a couple of books, one titled Between Paradigms, another titled Of Another Nature. His work has been presented in a number of solo exhibitions at places like the Everson Museum of Art in Syracuse, Contemporary Arts Museum in Houston, the Corcoran Gallery, the Howard Wise Gallery, the Castelli Gallery, the Long Beach Museum of Art, and so on and so on. I thought maybe a good introduction to Frank would be, I really enjoyed combing back through some of his older publications. So I thought, as a way of whetting your appetite for this evening's remarks, I might read some select statements to give you a sense of the range of Frank's thinking. Here, for example, is something he wrote in 1989. Visual/plastic art, on the other foot, springs from a bulging rhizome of illusion, fiction, delirium, and enchantment. Very generally speaking, it desires to draw blood from a turnip. One assumes, that was from 1989, this is a statement from 2003, one assumes a priori that the practice of art is inextricably linked with the axial core of consciousness. Further, art is the ne plus ultra of its manifestation in the world. Art is not a mere arbiter of the moment's fashion and taste. It is the functional embodiment of immanent knowledge, crucial to the maintenance of sentient existence, civilized discourse, and ecological accord. Or, from 1991, in a cultural environment where the now dominant Cartesian Newtonian axis has, by means of analogy and metaphor, reduced the physical world to clockwork and billiard balls, thank you, David Hume, is now in the shaky hands of the present digital culture. This is from 1991. At the other end of the spectrum rests the essential Freudian insight: you are who you have become, which is, of course, a simplification, but just barely. From 1989. So here is where we are, in some kind of neither land, where shit and shinola are indistinct, where the topical and the ontic meld into a blur of victim-centric interpretation, where my ism is superior to your ism, where the top dog wags its alpha tail, where all and everything is nothing but a simple gesture indicating dominance, power, and unabated absolute control. Welcome to our in-the-flesh reality. Welcome as well to doubt, suspicion, compunction, and ineluctable desire. You have arrived. 1989. Finally, from 2014, hence the above scattershot ambience, a portmanteau, a paradoxical collage-decollage in time, a farrago gliding adrift from hypnagogic to awakened states in all of their mutual regards. Now, in a further spirit of mutual regards, would you please welcome with me Frank Gillette.
Thank you. Where do we begin after that, huh? I've forgotten half the things I've ever said, more than half. Caveats are generally appended at the conclusion of an argument. In the present case, a caveat opens the argument. To wit, What follows is not a hypothesis or even a coherently formal statement. It is instead a wandering mosaic or a twisting archipelago of hunches, probes, remarks, conjecture, and rationalizations. That's a fair warning, correct? With this in mind, we commence with a frolic from the art historian Roland Penrose. Picasso is hanging out at Kahnweiler's gallery in Paris, and a nouveau riche, boorish rookie collector arrives to meet Picasso. And they go through the formal exchanges, and finally, the rookie goes into a fit of pique, complaining that Picasso should paint reality, that he doesn't paint reality, he ignores reality. Things are not like the way he paints, things are not real. And Picasso asked, well, what do you mean by reality? And the rookie pulled out his wallet and removed a photograph of his wife. And he said to Picasso, no, that's reality. And Picasso replied, she is rather flat, isn't she? And small. Keep this in mind when we discuss photography. That's the point. Now, employing this gag as an introduction to the crucial distinction between modernity and modernism. And this is emphatically not a simple distinction without a difference. From this perch, modernity was launched in the West with the Industrial Revolution in the late 17th century, the publication of Beethoven's Eroica in 1804, and most saliently, Fox Talbert's 1839 address to the British Academy on the invention of photography, back to Picasso's sly quip. Modernism, on the other hand, arrives at the opening 2 decades of the 20th century. At the opening, we discover the work of Einstein, Planck, Cezanne, Picasso, Stravinsky, Joyce, Ibsen, Wittgenstein, Edison, Tesla, Duchamp, and Freud, among others, including the great and marvelous precursors to modernity, Emily Dickinson's poetry and the construction of the Eiffel Tower in 1887. Beginning in the mid-1960s, a third pivot emerges, culminating with our analog-digital divide. More about that later. Backing up a bit, there are 4 epistemologies or ways of knowing the world: religion, art, science, and philosophy. The most significant and relevant and critical of these centers on the clash, or at best, the wobbly equipoise between art and science, and the rather contentious art-science split reduces to this: tacit versus objective knowledge. Science's positions are grounded in a sacrosanct objectivity governed by an apprehension of the sovereignty of nature, both local and cosmic. It is based upon the postulates such as facts, testing, proof, evidence, calculation, and consensus. Art, in contrast, is an embodiment of tacit knowledge, characterized by intuition, instinct, a sixth sense, inklings, premonition, a second sight, and the ability to comprehend something without regard to the requirements or need of conscious reasoning. Nevertheless, several scientific models are relevant with regard to art's descriptive requirements. Pardon me, I get dry. It's gin, not water. here's where, this may depart from my notes, this is where the discourses of art can absorb the discourses of science. I think there are two essential examples. One is one of my favorite hobby horse thinking sprees is this. And it's the work of Tinbergen and Lorenz, two ethologists, ethology being the study of animal behavior, which they won a Nobel Prize for. And it goes like this. They developed a rather shallow, maybe 6 inches deep, a container, something like a pool table, with escape routes on 4 sides and in the center, exactly like a pool table. And in the middle of it, they placed a newborn chicken, fresh out of the egg. And over it, they waved a silhouette of a chicken hawk. And the newborn chick, immediately ran for cover. Immediately ran, it was never personally threatened by this silhouette of a chicken hawk, but it split for the cover. Then they did the same thing again with a chicken, or rather a chick, and they put a shape in a silhouette which was nowhere near like a chicken hawk, and the chick just wandered around, no problem. This implies that there's something in the nervous system of the chick that included that silhouette of the chicken hawk, oddly enough. This is the premise from which Tinbergen and Lorenz developed. Now, what I'm arguing is that in an infinitely more complex way, there exists in the collective and private nervous systems of the planet, there exists there a kind of inbred sense of shape, form, harmony, correlations, ratios, etc., that are already in place. A byproduct of this claim is that the idea that beauty is in the eye of the beholder is nonsense. The beholders flatter themselves. Beauty is instead in the system, the collective and private systems of our nervous constructs, and develops in ways in which we add our environmental processes, attitudes, etc., and then develops therein. But the beginning of it, what I'm arguing in effect, rushing to this conclusion, is that the fact that, that the formulations of art are distinct and separate from the world is a farce. The world is embedded in our thinking about the aesthetic. The second is essentially a borrowing from mathematics, highly estranged mathematics. Very few people follow these arguments. And it is this, that there are basically 3 mathematical procedures that I think artists can learn from, once they're addressed, can acquire them and apply them. And they are these. There's a process in mathematics called the heuristic. Heuristics is the following, that you don't have a goal in mind when you set off on a process, on a development. You only have an algorithm or so, a methodology of moving along, and you don't know what you're going to achieve until you encounter it. So there's no pre-existing model as what you're aiming for. It's just a wandering, and then you arrive at something because it emerges from the fact that you're wandering. But you don't begin with a target. You don't begin with a conclusion. So the heuristic model can apply to art making, is what I'm suggesting. The second is stochastics. A stochastic process, for example, can be best described with an analogy. Think of a dart game, and you take an arrow, excuse me, not an arrow, a dart, and you attempt to hit the bullseye. That's an anti-stochastic. A stochastic process would be, analogously speaking, taking a fistful, a clutch of darts and throwing them at the dartboard with the understanding that one of them will hit the bullseye without aiming at it. Another example of stochastics in nature is, for example, an apple tree. An apple tree in its full bloom will drop maybe 2 dozen, 3 dozen apples, and only one will become another tree. And that's extended by a bird coming along and picking at the seeds and going away and taking a poop, and that becomes another tree. So there's, it becomes wildly intricate after a while. So stochastics is another measure of determining how to produce a work of art. It can be. The third is the most elusive, and that's haptics. Haptics is the mathematical process in which, without an algorithm, you tend to feel by experimentation, poking here, poking there, developing a kind of bias towards what's happening, and finally achieving something akin to a solution. A good example of hapsis, for example, would be a blind person in a dark room with a person of sight. Who gets out of the room first? The blind one, of course. And that's an example of feeling your way. It's an analogy towards about feeling your way towards a solution. Enough of science for the moment. Now consider Martin Buber's I-thou versus the I-it correlation and description between, say, one and nature. Buber was a marvelous Hebraic philosopher, argued that there are 2 kinds of relationships. It's the I-it relationship, like my relationship with this, and the I-thou relationship, in which there's a sense of intercommunity between the viewer or the sender and the receiver. And he, by implication, his argument is that we've reduced ourselves to an I-it relationship, excluding the sense of thou. Now, while this culture regards nature with a near exclusive I-it relationship, our prehistoric brethren respond to, say, a lush glade or a ravishing interwoven grove with awe. Such Paleolithic hunter-gatherers were enchanted by and ubilant over its radiance, rendering it sacred and preserving its revered status. Now that's an I-thou relationship. Meanwhile, our contemporaries pass a similar glade or grove and decide how to privatize it, where to put the condos, the golf course, the shopping mall, and how best to market the resulting timber from the clear cutting. Thus, one foundational purpose of the visual/plastic arts is to do nothing less than to resist the vandalizing of nature while embracing the re-enchantment of the world, a daunting and dicey existential responsibility if there ever was one. There is a contrast between the I-thou and the I-it. Aside from re-enchanting, yet another responsibility or option for the artist is this: to intercept and redeploy evolving communications technologies. That is, turning them towards aesthetic ends, such that novel forms of information, aesthetic and otherwise, emerge thus creating, in Bateson's famous phrase, quote, a difference making the difference. 3 examples of this are Sony's Portapack, which arrived in 1966, Apple's hardware, and Adobe software. I'll depart from my notes to describe what I mean in effect, because I've experienced it. When Sony developed a portable television system in 1966 and marketed it, it didn't have artists in mind. It didn't make this system of decentralized portable television for artists. It made it for advertising. It made it for people who wanted to record board meetings. It made it for the police. Artists were the last thing it had in mind. But it was intercepted by artists and then converted into an aesthetic process. The same thing applies with computers, particularly the software in Adobe software, for example, Photoshop, Illustrator, and so on. Final Cut Pro is another one. They were not designed for use by artists, for the implementation by artists. They were done for basically architectural designers and other kind of technicians and engineers. But they were intercepted by artists, and hence you have basically digitally developed and produced works of art which come from the computer. Its medium is the computer. Now, a third option, after re-enchanting the world, intercepting technology, high technology, there's a third option for the artist in today's environment. It wasn't always like this. And the third option, excuse me, I'm confusing myself. I do that frequently. The third option is that authentic and significant art functions best in uncharted territory. So it's neither the task of the artist, the third version, to be either involved in the re-enchantment of the world or the interception of high technology. It is instead to carry on the classical traditions of either picture making, object making, etc. Now, there are many ways to approach the possibilities in the third option. I'll give you a quote to begin with it. Failure, quote, this is a quote, "Failure is a portal to success," end quote. That's from James Joyce. So there's a lot of wandering, again, going back to the heuristics, heuristic wandering in attempting to extend and develop the traditional forms of art, like classical painting and classical sculpture, for that matter, photography in the classical sense as well. Let's assume in this third option that we go back to our Paleolithic ancestors. Consider the condition of obviously the vocabulary at the time was, we're talking about between 15 and 50,000 years ago. In that frame of time, especially the further back you go, the more extreme the example, artists or people who made images on grotto surfaces did not do it for a review in art forum or to make a lot of money or to become a celebrity. They did it for the fact of survival. It was intrinsic to the survival, the belief was. Now consider, a Paleolithic so-called artist crawling through a very slim tunnel, carrying the patella of a deer filled with grease and lit, right? Imagine this. And crawling in a group generally, maybe 15, 30, 35 feet into an opening grotto. because they didn't live in grottos, and they didn't work in grottos. They lived in overhanging caves, and they went into the grottos to do their work. And what they did with all this effort was intrinsically linked with survival. The idea being, according to Louis-Gourhan, who was the great scholar on this subject, was that if they could capture an image of the animal in which they were hunting, they would be more successful or have the success in the hunt. So there was a magical connection between making an image and surviving, physically surviving. That connection has been broken and lost, back to Buber's thou and it issue. Clearly, the Paleolithic artist had an I-thou relationship, not an I-it relationship. It's basically all about a kind of pulse-quickening perception and cognitive force. That when artistic, or the work of artists, a better term, was connected infinitely more intimately with survival, its meaning was effulgent. It was obviously, it was necessary. It had the force of necessity behind it. Whereas once you get into the I-it relationship, even art is succumbing to a kind of withdrawal from that initial magical connection between making art of any sort and surviving. Now, Walter Benjamin, for example, going back to the issue of enchantment and aura, Benjamin argued that aura had been dismissed because of the mechanical reproduction of actually the mid-20th century, early 20th century. And this is often given the status of the oracle at Delphi. It's amazing how influential this text has become, and I take umbrage with it. Not because it's such a popular, ingrained meme, but because I think it's basically wrong. The issue is not to dismiss, in Benjamin's terms, the fact of reproduction because it removes the aura of the single object. The real issue is, how do you skip that stage and reinvest aura in a reproductive object or a picture, a photograph, for example? One of the problems with, I'm told, since I worked with computers extensively, is that it is no hand-eye axis. Let's say you have no sense of touch, you have no sense of surface, it's all on a screen, it's all basically, when you come down to it, a series of zeros and ones. And then it's converted, of course, into an image. But so the question becomes, how do you invest a highly digitalized medium with the same value as the hand-eye axis, or a sense of touch being an example of the hand-eye axis? It's not Benjamin's complaint that is interesting, it's what he avoided. But on the other hand, he arrived early in the game, in this digital game. He wasn't, in fact, he died of suicide in about 1943? 1940, thank you. So the issue is, how do you invest aura in mechanical means? Not how do you give up on mechanical means because they do not possess aura. One of the other classical functions, or the third option, is the role of ambiguity. Now, in your love life, you don't want ambiguity. In your financial life, you don't want ambiguity. In your health assessments, you don't want ambiguity. Ambiguity in all of those categories is essentially a bad thing, something to be rejected. But in art, you can entertain ambiguity. In fact, it's a very forceful content of art. Again, from Picasso, of all people. He once said, quoting him, "A green salad is sometimes a green parrot," end quote. It's not that funny. One of the key central offshoots of Pennamene's argument is the role of photography. In that, a photograph can be infinitely reproduced and therefore is without, the enticements of aura. Aura is nothing but kind of a ghostly presence in some cultures. But it exists in the West as a concept which is the equivalent in the 1950s and early 60s, for example, when I was a young puppy. I was actually once one, yes. No, I'm an old dog now. I'm not a puppy. There was a lot of talk. I mean, this is a sidebar now. There's a lot of things you can determine and measure by the way vocabularies change over time and through generations. The way we talk about art now, in general, I'm not talking about specifics, in general, is extremely different from the way we talked about it in the late 50s and early 60s. In the late 50s and early 60s, for example, the idea of presence was the equal of aura. That a thing no one talks about presence anymore. Not that I've noticed anyway. Perhaps there's an exception here. Does anyone here talk about presence anymore? Ah, there you go. I see. That's because you're an old dog too. There you go. So aura and presence in photography against Pennamene's position. Now, the counterpoint to Pennamen is Roland Barthes. Barthes, on his essay on photography, the wonderful Roland Barthes, by the way, argues that a sloppy, offhand, simple, pedestrian snapshot of Napoleon would tell us more about Napoleon than all of the great paintings and portraits of Napoleon. There is something about a photograph which has an indexical recording, right? It does not go through the medium of the artist. It goes through the mechanism of this indexical process. It's like a thumbprint being an indexical process, or stepping into a puddle. That a photograph, despite all of its mechanical background and the restrictions of its purpose and employment, is in effect a greater conveyor of a particular kind of essential truth than all of the paintings ever produced, especially in the West. I speak mostly in terms of the West. Although I'm a great fan of the East, I don't think I'm in a position to speak for it. So that contradiction between the mechanical aspect of a photograph and the effect it has, which cannot be reproduced any other way because of its indexicality. Now, back to the issue of ambiguity. Only within the precincts of artistic endeavor can you effectively employ ambiguity in a positive sense. You can actually enjoy ambiguity in a positive sense. I mean, the green salad and the green parrot is just one example. Another would be the whole category of pateola. pediola, rather, which is the study of the following kind of ambiguity: looking at a cloud and seeing a swan, looking at a root and seeing a snake, looking at a deposit of coffee grinds and seeing a face. So it's both. It's both a cloud and a swan. It's both a snake and a root. It's both a coffee grind and a face. This kind of oscillation between the two is another kind of ambiguity, also employable by aesthetic means. Another example would be Wittgenstein, the great Wittgenstein, produced a diagram. It's called the duck-rabbit oscillation. Are we all familiar with it? In which that's another manifestation of ambiguity. Ambiguity is an extremely complex and deep set of associations and relationships in the human mind. The human mind, which is, I think, all of us possess, this gelatinous pile of mess in your cranium. Well, by the way, that's not really where your mind is at. The Greeks believed it was in your heart and so on. This represents, in other words, cutting to the quick, perhaps several quicks at the same time, is that it matters to us that we engage ambiguity because of its pleasure and not avoid it because of its confusion. It produces confusion. For example, you don't want to go to a physician and give you an ambiguous answer, either one way or the other. It's for another kind of ambiguity is the following, and I mean this as an aside. Should not be taken seriously, that is to say. When we pray, it's called talking to God, right? When God talks to us, it's called schizophrenia. Really? Now there's a slice of ambiguity for you. So I'm trying to distinguish what I consider the third option for the artist in its responsibilities, in a way. All three, I think these are three domains, in other words, and all three deserve a kind of separate evaluation and understanding. Now, there's a distinction in this issue of ambiguity and pleasure, and that's between the random and the arbitrary. The random process is not an arbitrary one. An arbitrary process or occasion is not a random one. And one of the issues in the third option is the one of which, how do you harvest randomness? How do you harvest chance? There's the wonderful work of Jacques Monod, Chance and Necessity, in which he argues basically that all of life's processes are dependent upon chance and necessity, the combination of chance and necessity. This, of course, is a kind of twisted variation on the Darwinian proposition of random mutation because of optimal circumstances of survival. It's all about chance and randomness. And Monod's remark extends to an interesting phrase of his in which he says, surfaces, and this is a quote, surfaces recognize each other, end quote. That is so simplistic in a way, But if you reflect on it, it's really extraordinarily profound. Surfaces recognize each other. Now, beyond the elusive quality of presence being the old way of talking about aura, or the ancient way of talking about aura. Now, one more aspect that applies to all three options, the reenchantment of the world, the interception of technology, and the classical distinctions of history. And that is the agonistic spirit, the spirit of agon. In brief, the spirit of agon goes something like this. I enter into my adult, serious portion of my life, post-childhood or whatever, and I am under influences, as everyone has been under influences. And over the process of time, over the unfolding of time, I begin to resent these influences. And I put myself up as a constitutional embodiment of the opposite of these influences. And therefore, I overthrow these influences and create something else. A good example of this, again, is the relationship between Cézanne and Picasso. Picasso was deeply influenced by Cézanne, and through the agonistic drive, separated himself, and hence you have the blossoming of Cubism. How do you evolve from that resistance to the influence that basically you drag with you into your professional life? How do you both acknowledge the influence, and how do you overcome it? This, in combination with the distinction between the arbitrary and the random, or chance and necessity, becomes a kind of integrated melting ball of wax, so to speak. It all combines, congeals around the issue of the spirit of development or projection or ambition even in aesthetic undertakings. Quoting Duchamp, who said, quote, "Art is a mirage," end quote. Well, give me 5 more minutes and I'll try to sum up. I was recently asked via email what I thought about the current scene, the art world's current scene. And I'm going to give you literally what I wrote back. And I still hold to this position. I wrote back, much of the current art, and I have art in quotes, is trite, boring, trivial, stilted, and mercantile, brimming with pastiche, vacuity, puffery, and petulance. Although some, and probably there were more than I anticipated, some works of art appear to be blissfully rambunctious. Back to the third option, which I've given less attention to than the other two. Art is, basically, in the third option, art develops novel exploratory acts and processes, seeking out elegant systemic patterns which connect in original ways and means. That means the components of what anyone works with, both the explicit ones and the implicit ones. For example, in the case of a painter, the explicit ones would be the pigment, the brushes, the palette knife, the surface. And the implicit ones is how do you interact with these explicit ones. So you take an explicit entity and you mix it up or do something, apply to it, and it becomes an implicit phenomenon. Now, that's what I mean by developing exploratory processes and seeking out elegant systemic patterns which in fact connect. All right. It was so orderly when I did all of this afternoon, and now it's become a kind of, you know, nest of whatever. All right, finally, and we skipped over a few parts I missed because of my lateness. Finally, and in sum, art is the chief agency for re-enchanting the world. And it is charged with carrying out this responsibility with poise, precision, and audacity. However, time is very short. Ecocidal policies have delivered us rather, to the brink of ecological collapse. While a thin and delicate membrane separates civilization from anarchic savagery. And that very membrane is being breached, is being compromised. A great 6th century Taoist adage comes to mind, quote, "To know and not to act is not to know," end quote. Thus, action is predicated on knowing, while art is a distinct way of knowing. Hence, art's potential for instigating action under the aegis of survival. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Frank. Frank has agreed to field some questions. I'm going to give whoever has a question the microphone so it gets recorded. Anastasia.
Hi. So I was just wondering, you mentioned how most of art is...
I can't hear you.
I'm sorry. I was wondering, you mentioned how most of art is trite or boring,
Current.
etc. Current, yeah.
Yeah.
So, and some of it is rambunctious. So do you think there's always been that system, or it's new?
No, I think over the last 50 or so years, I'm being a little, maybe make that 40, art has become increasingly mercantile. It's basically a business. And from my generation's point of view, art is a way of life, not a small business. And that mercantilization has rendered things as they are, and which I'm pessimistic about. Next, anyone else? Okay, Robert.
Frank, you haven't changed.
I haven't changed?
You still have charm, wit, intelligence, and good looks.
I don't know about the good looks.
Frank, you know how I know that?
How?
Because I have the same qualities.
All right, go for it.
Frank, a question. As far as I know, Benjamin did not attribute the aura to anything in particular, and I'm wondering if you would consider the aura either something given or something assigned, number one. Number two is, do you feel the retrieval of the thou is very close, in fact, to the retrieval of the aura?
Good point. I'll take the first part first. I think it's both. We're going to cut the baby in half. It is both assigned and intrinsic. And this is hard to prove. This is just a hunch. It's hard to prove. And the second is a far more interesting connection between the I-thou relationship and aura. And I would say they're intimately interconnected, yes. You would agree? I would. Okay.
I have a follow-up on that.
You have a quarrel with me?
Follow-up.
Oh, I...
So I thought you made a really good case about positing the Barth idea about the photograph and its, what I would call iconic power, let alone the information that it can give, versus what you talked about in terms of Benjamin and the whole idea about the aura. But what about now? Because both of those things have in their stillness of their iconic power, we could attribute, let's say, a new idea of aura to that photograph. But what about now with the digital? Is there an aura to the ephemeral, virtual, cyber, infinite moving image that we can't hold on to? Or is aura over?
I would argue in response is that there's probably a slow re-emergence of aura in a new set of parameters. That is to say, aura itself will go through a transition. It's no longer looking at a religious icon, which is the origin of aura, by the way. And it would be, it would have to be able to bridge the analog-digital divide. In other words, once you're on the digital side of that divide, aura has to have a presence, no pun intended.
A mutant aura?
Hmm?
A mutant aura?
No, I think a more fleeting one. Swiftly fleeting. Because the information process...
Is that a contradiction?
I often contradict myself.
What conundrum?
In which one should take
Wait a sec. What was that?
Well, I was going to say one thing in relationship to this discussion, but then I had a question. But if we think about how most art that has been produced was not by single artists, so to speak, but by practitioners, craftspeople, repeating and repeating and repeating, sometimes the same image over and over and over. In that way, it was reproduced over and over and over. It's just not mechanically, but there was an infinite amount of, and also just repetition of the same thing. Yeah.
Templates.
And so, but I was going to ask you to talk a little bit more about how the difference between scientific endeavor and the word invention, which is used in science, I'm inventing something, and the same word is used when artists of our generation, the older generation, produce something that we consider to be unique. We say we've invented something, and the whole idea was to push something a little bit, to not repeat, to push something a little bit more originality.
Originality is a measure of merit.
Yeah, and I do think this kind of bifurcation between science and art is, I'd love to see it begin to circle back on itself a little bit, or to try to understand what the actual, because you know, scientists and artists think in very similar ways, at least initially. They get involved in things that other people take for granted. Like, why do we breathe? Like, oh, well, everybody else just takes it for granted, but a scientist sits and wonders, oh, about breath. An artist would make a metaphor or something out of breath, but we all don't take things for granted. We wonder about sometimes dumb things other people think would be dumb. So we have curiosity in the same way. We think outside the box. So what is this relationship between the two? It's bifurcated, but it's still a very strong core, I think.
Right.
Okay, so that's my question.
Thank you.
All right.
I disagree.
Okay, good.
I think... Alice, I always generally agree with you, but in this case, well, it's a modified disagreement. I think the strongest position, am I in your way?
No, I'm in your way.
The strongest position for art as a epistemological phenomenon is to be the foil of science. Of course we share things, but these things are peripheral and in some cases even trivial. Of course they're curious and we're curious. Of course they produce obscure insights. Of course, all of that is true, but I think it is peripheral. The real issue is producing a tacit knowledge as opposed to an objective one, in quotes. Now, people like Polanyi, for example, Michel Polanyi, the great Hungarian philosopher, argued that even science, though, he would disagree with me now I'm taking him on as well. You're in good company, by the way. He would argue that even science is value-laden. And art is intrinsically value-laden, whereas science attempts to be non-value-laden. So, but there's another philosopher of science, Paul Feyerabend, who basically says the same thing. So there are dissenters from this point of view.
Thomas Kuhn as well.
Well, Kuhn is another story. Kuhn and Feyerabend are pretty close. Feyerabend's more radical than Kuhn. That's why he's less popular. Feyerabend basically argues that science is essentially a political game. It's like who got the money, who has the connections. Those hypotheses will be forwarded. People who have the real hypotheses will be buried because of the lack of connection, money, influence, long life, and so on. I'll give you a great example. I've always been fascinated by this one. Leibniz, the great Leibniz, Gottfried, sent to Newton in Britain at the time, at the British Academy, where Isaac Newton was chief bottle washer, and he sent his papers on the invention, the creation of differential equations. When Newton got the package in the mail or by courier, he looked at it, was astonished, and buried it. It was his version of the differential equation that will go for it. So he suppressed. That's a value-laden maneuver. Does that make sense? I mean, well, okay, if it doesn't make sense, I have something else. I'll add something else.
Well, I mean,
I'll make it even more confusing.
This is a question I've been asking myself, but one of the things, and then we should move on to what.
No. It's a very.
I remember reading an article in Scientific American about Bruegel and blind leading the blind, which was a kind of biblical subject.
Mm-hmm.
And according in Scientific American, they said that he was so observant when he made this painting that they could actually diagnose the kinds of blindness that the various figures had on the basis of how accurately he painted. Now that's a period in history, in art history, in which there was a kind of collusion, if we want to call it a collusion, or a bonding of both. The Tower of Babel, for instance, his Tower of Babel has all of the construction inventions of the day are building the Tower of Babel, so he uses those. Now, it's just, in my mind, it's a kind of wonderful period in which there was more or less a coming together, or as opposed to a splitting apart of knowledge. But now we've become so specialized, everything is so split apart that everybody is in their own little category. But anyway, we should probably move on. I don't know that we can solve.
No, I grant.
I've been wondering about it for a long time.
Here's the point, and why I disagree, and why I believe that art's position vis-a-vis science should be as a foil. Because the dominance of so-called objectivity, valueless laden, without value, despite Newton and despite Feyerabend and despite, to some extent, Polanyi, is that that interaction, that dialectic, has to be is essential in a way for civilization to continue. We can't, in other words, the scientific vision of the world is necessary, but it's insufficient. And in its insufficiency, it requires a foil, which is art, in my opinion. Now, it used to be a correlation between religion, for example, or even in a philosophical sense, a correlation between ideas and compounds of ideas within the philosophical domain. But in being necessary but insufficient, it's still insufficient. And art should be the foil that provides that sufficiency. So therefore, they are in contest. They are in contest.
Stephen has the last question.
Oh my God, it's actually more of a statement.
Stephen has the last.
I want to go back to the. Is this on?
It's just recorded.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay.
It's a foil.
Think of it as art.
Now I'm going to go back to the aura question, because I wonder how many of the students. I wonder how many of you have you ever read the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction?
Everybody
Have most of you
has.
read it? Yeah. But the importance of the question of aura is really, I mean, another way to talk about that would be the magical aspect of a work of art. And so the question that Benjamin talks about is the loss of this magical aspect of a work of art and what might replace it. And for Benjamin, it's Marxism, the replacement, essentially. That he's both mourning and celebrating the loss of this magic. But contra Benjamin, as Frank was talking about earlier, if you look back now at works of art from the period Benjamin was writing, like, say, Casablanca, those works have become highly erratic. They have, because there are two sides of this aura. One side is the sacred nature of the production, and the other side is the varnishing of history, the glow that comes onto things in the past. So in relation to the digital present, that becomes a very interesting question. Things in the past become erratic almost automatically because they're old, but they don't necessarily become magical in an active way that produces future culture out of themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Whether the relation of the body, which is part of the Benjaminian argument, right, about what makes things sacred, that they're handled in sacred ways, how that translates into an unphysical world, that remains to be seen, and that's what the students will have to find out for themselves. Can you achieve a technology that has that kind of physical material eloquence?
Or something else.
But I mean, whatever form it might take. I mean, in Benjamin's time when he's writing about film, he didn't see it as having that kind of eloquence as a way that we may or may not see it as having it now. But when you look at these old films now, that the technology has become old, they're full of flavor and texture based on their age. So for me, it's impossible to separate the question of aura from my distance from Casablanca, which is not very far, and my distance from the present, which in some ways is much farther.
That's a nice place to end. The distance from the present is way too far.
Okay.
Thank you, Frank Gillette. I'm Tom Mahoon. I chair the BFA program in Visual and Critical Studies. We're very happy to be hosting this evening's event. We're very fortunate to have with us Mr. Frank Gillette. Let me tell you just a little bit about Frank before I turn it over to him. Frank was born in 1941 in Jersey City. He attended for just a couple of years Columbia University, then he dropped out. Then he spent a couple more years at Pratt Institute, and then he dropped out. Those things seem not to have diminished his ability to become the recipient of many quite distinguished awards, including fellowships from the Rockefeller Foundation, the Guggenheim Foundation, grants from the New York State Council of the Arts, the National Endowment for the Arts. He was at the American Academy in Rome in the mid-80s. He's the author of a couple of books, one titled Between Paradigms, another titled Of Another Nature. His work has been presented in a number of solo exhibitions at places like the Everson Museum of Art in Syracuse, Contemporary Arts Museum in Houston, the Corcoran Gallery, the Howard Wise Gallery, the Castelli Gallery, the Long Beach Museum of Art, and so on and so on. I thought maybe a good introduction to Frank would be I really enjoyed combing back through some of his older publications. So I thought, as a way of whetting your appetite for this evening's remarks, I might read some select statements to give you a sense of the range of Frank's thinking. Here, for example, is something he wrote in 1989. Visual/plastic art, on the other foot, springs from a bulging rhizome of illusion, fiction, delirium, and enchantment. Very generally speaking, it desires to draw blood from a turnip. One assumes, that was from 1989, this is a statement from 2003, one assumes a priori that the practice of art is inextricably linked with the axial core of consciousness. Further, art is the ne plus ultra of its manifestation in the world. Art is not a mere arbiter of the moment's fashion and taste. It is the functional embodiment of immanent knowledge, crucial to the maintenance of sentient existence, civilized discourse, and ecological accord. Or, from 1991, in a cultural environment where the now dominant cartoon
Rose. Picasso is hanging out at Kahnweiler's gallery in Paris, and a nouveau riche, boorish rookie collector arrives to meet Picasso. And they go through the formal exchanges, and finally, the rookie goes into a fit of pique, complaining that Picasso should paint reality, that he doesn't paint reality, he ignores reality. Things are not like the way he paints, things are not real. And Picasso asked, well, what do you mean by reality? And the rookie pulled out his wallet and removed a photograph of his wife. And he said to Picasso, no, that's reality. And Picasso replied, she is rather flat, isn't she? And small. Keep this in mind when we discuss photography. That's the point. Now, employing this gag as an introduction to the crucial distinction between modernity and modernism.
Cartesian Newtonian axis has, by means of analogy and metaphor, reduced the physical world to clockwork and billiard balls, thank you, David Hume, is now in the shaky hands of the present digital culture. This is from 1991. At the other end of the spectrum rests the essential Freudian insight, you are who you have become, which is, of course, a simplification, but just barely. From 1989. So here is where we are, in some kind of neither land, where shit and shinola are indistinct, where the topical and the ontic meld into a blur of victim-centric interpretation, where my ism is superior to your ism, where the top dog wags its alpha tail, where all and everything is nothing but a simple gesture indicating dominance, power, and unabated absolute control. Welcome to our in-the-flesh reality. Welcome as well to doubt, suspicion, compunction, and ineluctable desire. You have arrived. 1989. Finally, from 2014, hence the above scattershot ambience, a portmanteau, a paradoxical collage-décollage in time, a farrago gliding adrift from hypnagogic to awakened states in all of their mutual regards. Now, in a further spirit of mutual regards, would you please welcome with me Frank Gillette.
Thank you. Where do we begin after that, huh? I've forgotten half the things I've ever said, more than half. Caveats are generally appended at the conclusion of an argument. In the present case, a caveat opens the argument. To wit, what follows is not a hypothesis or even a coherently formal statement. It is instead a wandering mosaic or a twisting archipelago of hunches, probes, remarks, conjecture, and rationalizations. That's a fair warning, correct? With this in mind, we commence with a frolic from the art historian Roland Penn.